The rescue teams arrived 6 hours after the storm finally passed. And what they found at the emergency shelter would become a story told throughout the Korethi Dominion for generations to come. Dominant Serax led the team herself, her golden fur matted with rain and ash from the journey across the burned savannah. And when she approached the shelter door, she was met by a sight that stopped her in her tracks. A small Korathi cub stood in the doorway, with his fangs bared and his copper eyes blazing with defiance. And behind him she could see 2 more cubs positioned protectively around a figure lying on the emergency cot. "Identify yourself and state your intentions." The cub growled, and his voice cracked but did not waver. "I am Dominant Serax of the 4th Fleet," she replied, too surprised to be offended by the challenge. "And I am here to rescue you. The human stays with us," the cub said. "She is packed now, and you will not take her." Serax stared at the small figure before her and felt something shift in her understanding of the universe. Because what this cub was saying went against everything the Korathi believed about other species. "What is your name, young one?" she asked gently. "I am Thresh, son of Wrecker," the cub replied. "And this human carried us through fire and flood to save our lives. And she burned herself protecting us, and she nearly drowned pulling me from the river. And I will not let anyone take her from us." Serax looked past the cub to the figure on the cot, and she saw a small human female covered in burns and bruises, unconscious but breathing, with 2 cubs pressed against her sides and watching the rescue team with suspicious eyes. "No one is going to take her from you," Serax said softly. "We are here to help her, not harm her." Thresh studied her face for a long moment, and then he stepped aside and allowed the rescue team to enter. They found Wrecker alive in the ravine where Soyin had left him, protected from the fire by the pooling water, just as she had predicted. And they evacuated the entire group to the medical facility at the Korathi outpost. On the other side of the planet, Soyin remained unconscious for 3 weeks while her body healed from burns and hypothermia and exhaustion. And during that entire time, the cubs refused to leave her side. The medical staff tried to remove them at first, arguing that a sterile environment was necessary for the human's recovery. But they quickly learned that separating the cubs from their human was simply not possible. Thresh would bare his fangs at anyone who approached Soyin with hostile intent, and Kaura would curl up on the bed beside her and refuse to move. And Miro would stand guard at the door with the fierce dedication of a warrior twice his age. Eventually, the medical staff gave up and simply worked around the cubs. And Soyin's room became a strange sight that drew curious visitors from throughout the facility. When Soyin finally opened her eyes, the first thing she saw was 3 pairs of copper eyes staring down at her with expressions of overwhelming relief. "You are awake," Kaura said, and her voice was thick with emotion. "How long?" Soyin asked, and her throat was dry and rough from disuse. 23 days, Thresh replied. "And we have been here the entire time." Soyin looked at the 3 cubs who had refused to leave her, and she felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes. "You did not have to do that," she said. "Yes, we did," Miro replied. And it was the most words she had ever heard him speak at once. "Because that is what you do for Pack." The door opened and Wrecker entered, his massive frame filling the doorway. And he moved to Soyin's bedside with a grace that belied his size. "Human," he said. And his deep voice was rough with emotions that Korathi rarely expressed. "I have come to thank you for saving my cubs. You asked me to protect them," Soyin replied. "I was only doing what you asked. I asked you to take them to safety," Wrecker corrected. "I did not ask you to burn yourself shielding them from fire, or to carry them through smoke while embers scarred your flesh, or to throw yourself into a freezing river to save my eldest son from drowning." He paused, and when he spoke again, his voice was softer than Soyin had ever heard it. "I did not ask you to love them as if they were your own, but you did anyway. Soin did not know how to respond to that. So she simply reached out and took Thresh's paw in her hand. The same paw she had gripped so tightly during their flight through the fire. They are easy to love, she said simply. Wrecker was silent for a long moment. And then he did something that made every Karathi in the room gasp with shock. He knelt beside Soin's bed and pressed his forehead to her hand in the ancient gesture of pack acceptance. A ritual that had never in recorded history been extended to a non-Karathi. From this day forward, he said, you are pack, you are family, and what is ours is yours. And any who threaten you threaten the line of Wrecker and will face our fury. The cubs made sounds of joy and pressed closer to Soin. And she found herself at the center of a warm tangle of fur and love that she had never expected to find so far from home in the months and years that followed. The story of the human who clung to the predator cubs spread throughout the Karathi Dominion and beyond. And it changed the way many species viewed humanity. They were not just soft creatures who needed protection. The story said they were beings capable of extraordinary courage and selflessness, who would risk everything to protect the vulnerable, regardless of species or kinship. 10 years later, Thresh stood before the Galactic Council as the first Karathi diplomatic attached to human space. And when they asked him why his people sought alliance with humanity above all other species, his answer was always the same. Because when the storm came and my father fell, the human did not run, he would say. And he would touch the faint scar on his paw, where Soin's grip had been so tight that her nails broke his skin. She held us, and she carried us, and she bled for us. And she did not even think about leaving us behind. Humans do not protect because it is logical, he would continue. They protect because they cannot do otherwise. And that is why we trust them with our lives and our futures. The Karathi had 1,000 words for different types of strength. But they had no word for what Soin had shown them that night in the storm. So they borrowed a word from human languages. A word that described the act of suffering for another's benefit without expectation of reward. The word was compassion. And in all their travels across the galaxy, the Karathi had never found its equal in any other tongue, because only humans, it seemed, could look at frightened children who were not their own and feel a pull stronger than survival, stronger than logic, stronger than everything except the simple truth that someone needed help and they were there to give it. That was humanity's gift to the galaxy, and the Karathi would never forget it. Dawn came slowly to the burned savannah, and the twin suns of Vareth 7 rose through a sky still heavy with smoke and ash. And Soin stood at the edge of a swollen river and felt her heart sink in her chest. The storm had dumped enormous amounts of rain across the landscape. And what had been a gentle stream on their survey maps was now a raging torrent of brown water filled with debris and moving fast enough to knock a person off their feet. We have to cross that? Miro asked, and his voice was small and frightened. The shelter is on the other side, Soin replied. And she pointed to the structure she could see in the distance. A squat metal building that represented safety and warmth and medical supplies for her burned and battered body. We cannot swim, Kaura said. Karathi cubs are not taught to swim until we are older. Soin looked at the 3 young faces staring up at her with complete trust. And she felt the weight of their lives pressing down on her shoulders. Then I will find another way, she said. She walked along the riverbank, searching for anything that might help them cross. And her burned arms screamed in protest with every movement, but she ignored the pain and kept looking. Finally, she found what she was looking for. A large tree that had fallen across a narrow section of the river. Its trunk creating a natural bridge that spanned the churning water below. That will work, she said. More to herself than the cubs. It does not look safe, Thresh observed. And for once his voice held no challenge or pride. Only honest concern. It is not safe, Soin agreed. But it is our best option. She approached the fallen tree and tested it with her weight, and the trunk shifted slightly but held. And she took a deep breath and made her decision. I will cross first, she told the cubs. And once I reach the other side, I will guide each of you across one at a time. Let me go first, Thresh said. I am the eldest, and it is my duty to test the path for my siblings. No, Soin said firmly. I go first because if the log breaks, I would rather it be me who falls than any of you. Thresh opened his mouth to argue, but something in Soin's expression stopped him. And he simply nodded and stepped back. Soyan climbed onto the fallen tree and began to cross, placing each foot carefully on the wet bark and keeping her arms extended for balance, despite the agony it caused her burned skin. The river roared beneath her, hungry and cold, and spray from the churning water soaked her legs and made the bark slippery under her boots. She was halfway across when the log shifted suddenly, and she dropped to her knees and grabbed the bark with both hands. And for a terrifying moment she thought she was going to fall, but the log settled again, and Soyan crawled the rest of the way across on her hands and knees. And when she finally reached solid ground on the other side, she allowed herself 3 seconds to breathe before turning back to face the cubs. Kaura, first, she called across the water. Come to me slowly and do not look down. The small female cub climbed onto the log with shaking legs, and Soyan talked her through every step, keeping her voice calm and steady, even as her heart pounded with fear. You are doing wonderfully, Soyan said. Just a few more steps now. Keep your eyes on me. Kaura reached the other side and practically leaped into Soyan's arms. And Soyan held her for just a moment before setting her down and turning back to the river. Miro, you are next. The middle cub crossed with more confidence than his sister, his natural balance helping him navigate the treacherous path. And he reached Soyan's side without incident. Now you, Thresh. The eldest cub had watched his siblings cross, and he had seen how Soyan guided them with patience and care. And when he stepped onto the log, he moved with the careful determination of someone who understood the stakes. He was 3/4 of the way across when the log shifted again, more violently this time, and Thresh lost his footing and began to fall toward the churning water below. Soyan did not think, and she did not hesitate, and she simply threw herself forward onto the log and grabbed Thresh's arm before he could slip beneath the surface. The impact sent both of them plunging into the freezing river, and the cold hit Soyan like a physical blow and drove the air from her lungs. She held onto Thresh with a grip that nothing could break, and she kicked toward the surface with legs that felt like they were made of lead. And she could feel the current trying to drag them downstream toward rocks and fallen trees that would crush them both. Her head broke the surface, and she gasped for air. And then she was swimming toward the bank with Thresh clutched against her chest. And she could hear Kaura and Miro screaming from the shore. The water was so cold that her muscles were starting to cramp, and her burned arms were sending signals of such intense pain that her vision was beginning to blur at the edges. But she could see the bank, and she could see the 2 cubs reaching toward her. And she kicked harder and pulled herself through the water with the last reserves of strength she possessed. Her hand touched mud, and then she was dragging herself onto the shore with Thresh still held tightly in her arms. And she collapsed onto the ground and lay there coughing water while the 3 cubs gathered around her. Soyan! Kaura cried, and it was the first time any of them had used her name. Soyan, are you all right? I am fine, Soyan managed to say between coughs. Just need to rest for a moment. But her body had reached its limit, and as she tried to stand, her legs gave out beneath her and she fell back to the ground. The cubs exchanged looks of fear and determination, and then they did something that would have shocked any Korathi who witnessed it. They began to tend to the human who had saved them. Thresh helped Soyan sit up and supported her weight against his small body, and Kaura pressed herself against Soyan's side to share her warmth. And Miro ran to the emergency shelter and managed to activate the door controls with his small paws. Together, the three cubs half carried and half dragged Soin into the shelter, and they laid her down on the emergency cot and covered her with thermal blankets and stood guard over her as if she were the most precious thing in the universe. Thresh found the emergency beacon and activated it with trembling paws. And then he returned to Soin's side and took her hand in both of his. "Help is coming," he told her. "You have to hold on now." "I always hold on," Soin whispered. And then her eyes closed, and she slipped into unconsciousness. The three cubs looked at each other, and without a word they arranged themselves around the human who had saved them, pressing their warm bodies against hers, and keeping watch through the shelter's windows. Miro stationed himself at the door, his small fangs bared at the world outside, ready to defend their human against anything that might threaten her. She had protected them through fire and storm and flood, and now it was their turn to protect her. The fire moved across the savannah like a hungry beast, and the flames leaped from one patch of dry grass to another despite the rain, fed by something in the alien vegetation that burned even when wet Soin worked quickly, stripping off her equipment webbing and fashioning it into a makeshift harness. And she secured Kaura and Miro against her chest, where they clung to her with their small claws digging into her suit. Thresh was too large to carry the same way, and Soin took his paw in her hand and squeezed it firmly. "You will run beside me," she told him, "and you will not let go of my hand no matter what happens. Do you understand?" "I understand," Thresh said, and his voice was steady despite the fear in his eyes. Soin looked one last time at Wrecker lying in the ravine, and she hated herself for leaving him, but she knew the cubs had to come first. "The water in the ravine will protect him from the fire," she said, more to convince herself than the cubs, "and we will send help as soon as we reach the shelter." She did not wait for a response, and instead she began to run. The smoke was thick and bitter, and Soin pulled the collar of her suit up over her nose and mouth as she navigated through the burning landscape. And Thresh ran beside her with his small legs pumping furiously to match her pace. Embers fell around them like deadly snow, and Soin felt them land on her arms and back, where they burned through the outer layer of her suit and seared the skin beneath. She did not stop, and she did not slow down, and she did not cry out despite the pain. Kaura and Miro had buried their faces against her chest to escape the smoke, and she could feel their small bodies trembling with each breath they took. "Almost there," Soin gasped, though she had no idea if it was true. "Just keep running." A burning branch fell across their path, and Thresh tried to dodge around it, but his paw slipped on the wet ground, and Soin felt him start to fall, and she yanked him upright with strength she did not know she possessed. "Do not let go," she commanded, and Thresh nodded and gripped her hand so tightly that his claws drew blood. They burst through a wall of smoke and found themselves on a rocky outcrop that rose above the burning grassland. And Soin spotted a crevice in the rocks that was just large enough to shelter them from the flames. She pulled Thresh toward it and pushed him inside, then followed with Kaura and Miro still strapped to her chest. And they huddled together in the narrow space as the fire roared past on both sides. The heat was intense, and Soin pressed herself over the cubs to shield them with her own body, and she felt the back of her suit melting where it touched the superheated rock. Time seemed to stop, and the world became nothing but heat and smoke, and the sound of her own heartbeat pounding in her ears. And then, gradually, the roar of the flames began to fade. Soin lifted her head and looked out of the crevice, and she saw that the fire had passed them by, leaving behind a landscape of black ash and smoldering stumps. "Is it over?" Kaura whispered. "The fire is over," Soya replied. "But we still have to reach the shelter." She crawled out of the crevice and helped the cubs follow her, and she took stock of their situation with grim determination. Her suit was badly damaged, with burn patches across her arms and back that exposed raw and blistered skin. And every movement sent waves of pain through her body. The cubs were unharmed thanks to her protection. But they were exhausted and frightened and looking at her with eyes that held a new emotion she had not seen before. "You are hurt," Thresh said. And there was something like wonder in his voice. "I will be fine." Soyen lied. "You protected us," Thresh continued. "And you let yourself be burned so that we would not be hurt. That is what you do for the people in your care." Soyen said simply. Thresh stared at her for a long moment. And then he asked the question that had been building inside him since the storm began. "Why did you not leave us behind and save yourself?" He asked. "That is what any sensible creature would do. And my father told you to take us to safety, but he did not tell you to die for us." Soyen considered the question carefully before answering. "Because you were scared," she said finally. "And because I could help, and that is enough reason for me." "I do not understand," Thresh admitted. "I know," Soyen said gently. "And maybe one day you will, but for now we need to keep moving." She took his paw in her hand again, ignoring the pain from her burns. And they began walking toward the emergency shelter that she hoped was still standing somewhere in the distance. Meanwhile, back at the base camp, Dominant Serax stood in the command tent and listened to the fragmented distress signals that had been captured before the storm cut off all communication. She was older than Brecker, with gray streaking through her golden fur, and she had commanded Karathi military forces for longer than most humans had been alive. "Send search teams as soon as the storm clears," she ordered her subordinates. "Dominant," one of them said hesitantly. "The human is surely dead by now. And perhaps Wrecker as well." "Perhaps," Serax acknowledged. "But we will search anyway, because that is what honor demands." She turned to look out at the raging storm and thought about the small human female who had been assigned to work with Wrecker's team. And she wondered if the woman had died quickly, or if she had suffered. It did not occur to her that the human might still be fighting to survive, because in her experience, soft creatures did not last long when the world turned hostile. She would learn soon enough how wrong she was. The wind screamed across the savannah like a living thing, and Soyen had to brace herself against its force as she assessed their situation with the quick mind of someone who had survived dangerous fieldwork on a dozen different worlds. Wrecker was unconscious and far too heavy for her to carry, but she could see a shallow ravine about 20 meters to their left, and it would provide at least some shelter from the storm's fury. "Help me move your father," she shouted to the cubs over the howling wind. And to her relief, they responded immediately. Despite their fear, Thresh and Miro grabbed their father's arms, while Soyen and Kaura pushed from behind. And together they managed to drag the massive Karathi into the ravine, just as the sky opened up and rain began to fall in sheets so thick that Soyen could barely see her hand in front of her face. She positioned Wrecker against the ravine wall where he would be protected from the worst of the wind. And then she turned to the three cubs who huddled together nearby with their fur plastered flat by the rain. "We cannot stay here," Soyen said, and she had to shout to be heard. "The ravine will flood if the rain continues, and we need to reach the shelter. We will not leave our father," Thresh growled, and he bared his small fangs at her in a display of defiance that would have been frightening if he were fully grown. "Your father told me to take you to safety," Soyen replied, and she met his copper eyes without flinching. "And I intend to honor that request." "You are not our pack," Thresh snarled. "You are prey, and we do not take orders from prey." Lightning struck nearby, and the thunder was so loud that Kaura screamed and pressed herself against the ground. And Miro made a whimpering sound that he tried to hide by turning away. Soyen did not respond to Thresh's challenge with anger, And instead she simply crouched down and began unpacking her emergency thermal blanket from her belt pouch. "You were right," she said calmly. "I am not your pack, and by your standards, I am probably prey. But right now I am the only one who can keep you alive until help arrives." She spread the thermal blanket and held it open. And the material was designed to retain body heat and repel water. And it was large enough to cover all 3 cubs if they stayed close together. "Come here," Soyen said. And her voice was gentle but firm. Kaora moved first, crawling across the muddy ground toward Soyen with her ears flat against her skull. And when she reached the human, she pressed her trembling body against Soyen's side without hesitation. Miro followed a moment later, and he settled on Soyen's other side and buried his face against her shoulder like a frightened child. Seeking comfort from a parent, Thresh remained where he was, his young face twisted with conflicting emotions. And Soyen could see the battle happening inside him between his pride and his fear. "There is no shame in accepting help," Soyen said softly. "And your father trusted me to protect you. So please let me do that." Another bolt of lightning struck, closer this time, and the flash illuminated the ravine with harsh white light. And Thresh's resolve finally broke. He crossed the distance between them in 3 quick bounds and pressed himself against Soyen's chest. And she wrapped the thermal blanket around all 4 of them and held the cubs close as the storm raged overhead. The electromagnetic interference from the storm killed her suits, communication system, and then her life support monitors. And one by one, the lights on her equipment flickered and went dark. They were alone now, cut off from any hope of rescue until the storm passed. And Soyen could feel the cubs shaking against her body with cold and fear. "Would you like to hear a story?" she asked, and her voice was calm despite the chaos around them. "A story?" Kaora asked, her voice small and uncertain. "Humans tell stories to their young when they are frightened," Soyen explained. "And it helps them feel brave. So I thought it might help you as well." "Karathi do not need stories to feel brave," Thresh muttered. But he did not pull away from Soyen's embrace. "Then perhaps you can just listen and keep me company," Soyen said with a small smile. "Because I am frightened too, and telling stories helps me feel better." She began to speak, telling them tales of human children who had survived impossible situations through courage and cleverness, of young ones who had faced storms and fires and floods and emerged stronger than before. She told them about a human girl who had been lost in the mountains of Earth for 2 weeks and had survived by building shelters and finding food, and about a human boy who had protected his younger siblings during a disaster when all the adults had been injured. The cubs listened despite themselves. And as the hours passed and the storm continued to howl overhead, they gradually relaxed against Soyen's warmth. "Why do you tell these stories?" Miro asked eventually, and it was the first time he had spoken directly to her. "Because I want you to know that being small does not mean being helpless," Soyen replied. "And being frightened does not mean being weak. And sometimes the bravest thing you can do is hold on until the storm passes. Is that what you are doing now?" Kaora asked, "Holding on?" "Yes," Soyen said honestly. "I am holding on to you, and you are holding on to me. And together we are stronger than we would be alone." Thresh made a sound that might have been disagreement, but he pressed closer to Soyen anyway, and she felt his small claws grip the fabric of her suit. The storm showed no signs of weakening, and Soyen could see water beginning to pool at the bottom of the ravine. And she knew they could not stay here much longer. Then she smelled something that made her blood run cold. And she turned her head to look toward the mouth of the ravine and saw an orange glow that had nothing to do with lightning fire. And it was spreading across the savannah toward them with terrifying speed. Soyen looked at Wrecker's unconscious form, then at the 3 cubs who clung to her with complete trust in their young eyes. And she knew what she had to do. "We have to run," she said, and she began to move. Park Soin knelt in the purple grass of Vareth 7 and carefully collected a sample of the flowering vine that grew near her boots. And she placed it into a specimen container with the gentle hands of someone who had spent years studying alien life forms across dozens of worlds. The sky above her was a beautiful shade of orange, and twin suns cast long shadows across the vast savanna that stretched in every direction. And somewhere behind her she could hear the heavy footsteps of her Karathi escort approaching through the tall grass. "Human," the deep voice of Dominant Wrecker rumbled through the air. "You have wandered too far from the base camp again." Soin stood and turned to face the massive creature that towered over her. And even after 3 weeks of working alongside the Karathi, she still felt a small spark of awe every time she looked at one of them. Wrecker stood nearly 3 meters tall, with a body that resembled something between a lion and a bear from Earth, covered in thick golden fur that rippled over powerful muscles. And his eyes were the color of molten copper and held an intelligence that had taken humanity by surprise. "When I first made contact with the Karathi Dominion 5 years ago, I found a new species of vine," Soin replied, holding up her container. "And it seems to have properties that could be useful for medicine." Wrecker made a sound low in his throat that Soin had learned to recognize as mild annoyance mixed with reluctant respect. And then he turned his great head to look at something behind him. 3 smaller figures emerged from the grass, each one a miniature version of Wrecker himself, though they only came up to Soin's chest. And their eyes held the curious brightness of youth rather than the measured calm of their father. "My offspring wish to observe your work," Wrecker said. And there was something in his voice that might have been embarrassment. "And Karathi tradition demands that young ones learn through watching." Soin smiled at the 3 cubs and crouched down to be closer to their eye level. And she had learned their names during the first week of the survey mission. Thresh was the eldest, his fur darker than his siblings, and he carried himself with the proud bearing of a young warrior in training. And he watched Soin with suspicion in his copper eyes. Kaura was the smallest, a female with fur the color of pale sand, and she seemed more curious than afraid, often creeping closer to watch Soin work before darting back to her father's side. Miro was the middle child, quiet and observant, and he rarely spoke but seemed to miss nothing that happened around him. "Would you like to see what I collected?" Soin asked, and she held out the specimen container for the cubs to examine. Kaura took a hesitant step forward, but Thresh made a sharp warning sound and she stopped. And Wrecker watched the interaction with an expression Soin could not read before anyone could speak again. A harsh alarm began blaring from the communication device on Soin's wrist, and she looked down at it with confusion that quickly turned to concern. "Emergency weather alert," she read aloud. "A Class 7 electromagnetic storm is forming to the northwest and will reach this region in approximately 2 hours. Wrecker's entire body went rigid, and for the first time since Soin had met him, she saw something like fear flicker across his features. "We must return to the shuttle immediately," he said, and his voice had lost its calm authority and now carried an edge of urgency. "What is wrong?" Soin asked as she gathered her equipment. "I thought the Karathi feared nothing. The storms on this world are not like storms on other planets," Wrecker replied. And he was already herding his cubs toward the direction of their base camp. "They carry electromagnetic pulses that interfere with our neural implants. And without our implants, we become disoriented and unable to function properly." Soin felt her stomach drop as she understood the danger, and she hurried to keep pace with the Karathi as they moved across the savanna. The communication device crackled again and a voice came through, the pilot of their survey shuttle sounding stressed and apologetic. "Dominant Wrecker, this is Pilot Henrith, and I regret to inform you that the storm's leading edge has already reached the landing zone. and I cannot take off without risking the shuttle. And the earliest I can reach your position is 6 hours from now." Wrecker stopped walking and stood perfectly still for a long moment. And when he spoke, his voice was carefully controlled. "Understood, Pilot Henrith. We will proceed to the emergency shelter at coordinates 743. That shelter is 12 kilometers from your current position," the pilot replied. "And I do not know if you can reach it in time." "We will reach it," Wrecker said. And then he cut the communication and looked down at Soyen with an expression she had never seen before. "Human, I must ask something of you that goes against every instinct of my people," he said. "If I become incapacitated by the storm's effects, you must take my cubs and continue to the shelter without me. I will not leave you behind." Soyen said immediately, "You will," Wrecker replied. And his voice was firm, but not unkind. "My cubs are more important than my life. And you are the only one who will be unaffected by the electromagnetic interference." Soyen wanted to argue, but she could see in his eyes that this was not a request. And she nodded once in acceptance. They began moving again, faster now. And the cubs ran alongside their father with the natural grace of born predators. And Soyen had to jog to keep up with their pace. The sky to the northwest was changing, the orange fading to an ugly purple-black that spread across the horizon like a bruise. And Soyen could see flickers of strange, green lightning dancing within the approaching clouds. They had covered perhaps 4 kilometers when Wrecker stumbled for the first time. And he caught himself quickly, but Soyen saw the way his eyes lost focus for just a moment. "Father?" Thresh asked, and his young voice cracked with concern. "I am fine," Wrecker said. But he stumbled again almost immediately, and this time he went down to one knee. The cubs gathered around him with frightened sounds, and Kalra pressed her small body against his leg, while Miro and Thresh looked around as if searching for enemies to fight. Soyen moved to Wrecker's side and put her hand on his massive shoulder, and she could feel tremors running through his body as the storm's electromagnetic field began to affect his implants. "How much further to the shelter?" she asked. 8 kilometers, Wrecker managed to say. And his words were slurred, and his eyes kept losing focus. The storm was coming faster than predicted, and Soyen could feel the wind picking up around them, carrying the smell of ozone and something else she could not identify. Wrecker collapsed completely, his huge body crashing into the purple grass. And the cubs cried out in fear as they watched their father fall. Soyen stood over the unconscious predator and looked at the 3 frightened cubs who stared up at her with wide copper eyes. And then she looked at the storm that was racing toward them with impossible speed. The first bolt of lightning struck the plane less than 100 meters away, and the thunder that followed shook the ground beneath her feet. And Soyen made her decision in that moment. She would not let these children die, and she did not care what it cost her to save them.